All right, the gang's all here. Hi again. For anybody that wasn't here the first time, I said hi. A couple things I want to point out. We do have, I think most of you have seen some artwork from Phineas Jones, one of our panel members, that are being auctioned off tonight. All the money for that is going to go to Treehouse Cats. I don't know if it's an actual treehouse, but I think they do good things for cats. On top of that, we obviously have plenty of beer on tap, including beer from all the breweries that will be represented by our panelists here. So please make sure you keep a cold beer in your hand throughout this. Aside from that, aside from that, yeah, we've got a pretty exciting panel up here tonight. We've got, I'm excited about and grateful for the people that turned out for this. It's an exciting time in craft beer, a pivotal time in craft beer. I think there are a lot of, obviously, smaller breweries popping up all over the country, bigger breweries that are starting to ship their beers hundreds, even thousands of miles away. So as it grows, I think there are a lot of questions about how that growth will affect the culture of craft beer. I think there are a lot of questions about how you hold on to the identity and the brand of brewery as it gets bigger, as it goes from being regional to national. So questions that lead to questions that lead to questions. And I think within a couple hours we'll have nothing but answers. That's enough of me. We're going to introduce our moderator for the night, Kim Leshinski. Kim has built her career here in Chicago doing food and packaging design. She, combining her passions for design and craft beers, she began a blog 3 years ago called Hail to the Ale, which some of you are sure familiar with. That quickly spiraled into opportunities to represent female beer lovers, but also to work with, write, design, and curate events with local breweries, and in this case, local bars. So thank you, Kim, for putting this together. And
okay, we have Michael Kiser, founder of Good Beer Hunting, an online chronicle of the craft beer movement in the past 7 years. Good Beer Hunting is transformed into a brand and portfolio strategy practice, working with breweries big and small. He's worked with startups like Forbidden Root and Solemn, as well as seasoned breweries like Five Rabbit and Goose Island, as they position themselves to lead the next evolution of craft brewing. In 2009, Phineas Jones was rudely diverted from his attempt to be a respectable citizen, working as a freelance illustrator and screen printer, when he accidentally started his career in beer label design. He is now the in-house illustrator and designer for Acre Beer, which allows him to keep contributing to his cat's college funds and follow his true passion of trying to not be the literally worst banjo player ever. We have Perkins, who founded Kaper Design with her husband Dan, with the purpose of creating functional, unique, and curated restaurant and cafe spaces tailored to the needs of their clients. They've been honored to work on projects throughout the U.S., but call Chicago home. You can find their work locally at Dry Hop Brewers, The Savoy, and Bang Bang Pie, to name a few. We have Paul Schneider. So Paul's a former high school teacher who made the jump to brewing at Solemn by way of writing about the Chicago scene. His former blog, Chi-Town on Tap.
Paul Schneider!
Yeah! Chi-Town on Tap was the bridge to writing the Chicagoist Beer Beat, which led to his gig at Solemn Oath as their 4th employee. Besides brewing, he led the website development project and serves as editor for all of the brewery's written work.
Number 1 employee, Paul Schneider!
All right. Tony Magee is the founder of Lagunitas Brewing Company. He was born in Chicago and studied music composition until moving to San Francisco in 1987, where he founded the brewery in the fall of 1993. The new Lagunitas Chicago Brewery has begun brewing and will open its doors to the public at the beginning of June. Randy Mosher. Randy's the author of Radical Brewing, Tasting Beer, and the soon-to-be-published Mastering Homebrewing and a Beer for All Seasons. Randy has been homebrewing since 1984. He teaches for the Siebel Institute, is a creative consultant to the craft brewing industry, and a partner in 2 Chicago-based breweries, Five Rabbit and Forbidden Root, the country's first Botanic brewery. I think we do that a lot in the brewing industry with beer and understanding recipes and sort of how we derive at what beer is. I'm always continually intrigued by design and how that plays a role in the craft beer industry as it's expanding. So when Chris and I first started talking about the concept of an event that revolves around design, there's always kind of that worry, like, are other people going to think this is interesting, or am I just going to be talking to myself? So thank you so much. All of you have proved that there is a huge curiosity in what's going on behind the scenes, not just with brewing, but with also all of the brands that are coming into the industry here nationally. So what I wanted to do was start with a little bit of beer history, or beer label history, by taking a look back and at some observations that have evolved to the state that beer label design is today. So when we look back at some of the first breweries, and in particular European breweries, there seems to be a huge cultural influence. So brands were named after family or location they lived in. Logos often had a very crest-like appearance. Breweries usually make one type of beer, maybe 2, a light lager, a dark lager. But overall, there was a pretty standard equation when it came to packaging, when beer first started being packaging. You would see the branding taking up the top 2/3 of the can with the simple name beer, light beer, written below it. Sometimes there would be a can color change, but overall, pretty simple executions. We saw some of that early influence in American craft beer history as immigrants from Germany and Czech started breweries here in the U.S., but it should happen over time. And not just with beer, but with food, fashion, technology. The freedom to be creative and to break the rules has caused one generation after the next to somewhat abandon tradition and really seek their own way. So fast forward a few decades to 2014, creating something new is freaking hard, right? So we could have a whole discussion on just the challenges of trademarking alone, or trying to find an available website once you have an idea. But we're gonna stick to the fun stuff for now. But I think we can all agree that creating a brand is much like creating a beer. It's a labor of love that requires patience and passion. So for anyone who's read Randy's Tasting Beer, Radical Brewing, knows that beer history and nods to those who have done the work before us are major threads that tie his narrative together. So my first question for Randy, as someone who has designed labels and obviously collected labels, how have you seen design evolve in American craft beer since the rebirth?
That's really stuck in there. Well, okay, here's American craft brewery label design circa 1991. You find the name of the nearest available creek. You choose a critter. You have your cousin design some art of the critter. You stick the name of the creek in a banner, put some hops around it and some malts around it and a lot of ugly curlicues. And there's your label. And that radical act was compelling, right? Because the labels are all about communication, and what that label said is we have no idea what we're doing. And at that point, you really didn't want to buy beer from people who knew what they were doing, because that was Anheuser-Busch and Miller, Coors, right? So that act of being inept was a stamp of quality in a weird way. It was a stamp that, it was a sure sign that you were going to get something that wasn't mainstream beer, right? So that was, hugely important. And then I think one thing that's gone on since then, I mean, you get professionals like myself. I have had a career working for design studios and advertising agencies, and like Kim, I kind of came up through that route and found homebrewing and got into the beer thing. So you had some professional people getting in and trying to help breweries do a better job of telling their stories. So that was going on, and that was really, up until about 5 years ago. And then I think you could probably credit Nick Floyd with changing the model in a way of making labels make no sense at all. And I mean that in the best possible way, that the labels themselves, he was the first guy. It used to make me crazy because I'm coming from, I used to do work for Procter & Gamble, for crying out loud. And so Nick would have a label where you can't really even read the label from the front. You have to turn the whole bottle around to even figure out what the beer is. And it would be, I just couldn't understand it. And so now, you have this sort of third generation, I guess, of craft brew labels, like the Half Acre ones, where they really become art pieces in and of themselves, and the illustration and the whole vibe of the label is maybe even sometimes more important than the beer, or at least as important. So that's that's in a nutshell. I think that's where we are, where we've come. There's still plenty of people doing other things, and not everybody's following that Nick Floyd kind of model. But
Michael, so you've spent some time capturing stories of some of the craft beer pioneers like Steve Hindy of Brooklyn Brewing and our own John Hall of Goose Island. What are some challenges you think they face in terms of keeping their brands relevant and relatable over time?
Well, I think everybody faces the challenge of making their brand relevant at all to begin with. I mean, you mentioned some of these brewery labels that used to, find the nearest creek and a critter and put that name on there. There's, I would say, a good half of the market's still doing that. That's tough to be relevant now. But I think when the two brands that you just mentioned, Goose Island and Brooklyn, in craft beer terms, they're pretty huge brands. When they started, they were as grassroots as anybody else, and I think they brought an audience along with them that were very loyal, very curious, and very personal. As you become very large, and you're suddenly a Steve Hindy or a John Hall, you look much more like a Fortune 500 leader of one of America's great companies than you do a craft brewer starting out on a 3.5-barrel system or something of that sort. So I think it's hard for them to continue to tell a story that's as tangible and as small as people are used to hearing about craft brewers. I think those two brands in particular represent this sort of tension point that craft brewers have in general going into the future of, we've built up an industry that values really, really small stories, but some of us are making a lot of beer. And I think that becomes an ongoing challenge to remain, not only in the way that you present yourself as small, but to remain in your thinking to be quite small. And small in the way that is still personal and tells stories about yourselves as people rather than as companies or brands. And produces cool experiences or tells great stories rather than does, billboards and national TV spots. It becomes sort of a double-edged sword for companies that are, of those two examples in particular.
can I tell a real quick story about Steve Hindy? So Boston Beer, Brooklyn Brewing, Steve Hindy figured out he's a super tenacious guy, and he figured out really quickly that the best guy in New York to do work was Milton Glaser. You design geeks will know who he is. And he picked, figured out Glaser's the guy, and he started hounding him. He started calling him every day for weeks and weeks and weeks. And finally, Glaser just sort of did work for him to get him off his back. But that was like, he decided, I want Milton Glaser, and that's going to be that. So
and now he gets free beer for life. Milton Glaser just wrote an article, an op-ed in the New York Times talking about craft beer branding. And he kind of, yeah, mostly tearing it all to shreds.
Never show anything of mine to Milton Glaser. I don't want to hear it.
described the look of craft beer as intentionally quirkily amateurish. That was the phrase he used, quirkily amateurish, which I found to be kind of fascinating because I don't know, growing up with beers that way, it certainly resonated that that's very much what most of them looked like, mostly because they couldn't help themselves. But the beers that are coming out now are either sort of trying to look amateurish, almost intentionally, or they're kind of going in other, many different directions at once. Like the old school label of, the otter and a creek and this kind of thrown together thing. It kind of works almost as a facsimile now, as an identifier of, this is off the radar, this is craft beer. But so many craft brewers that are starting out now, even Tiny Nanos, Unine, I think, is a perfect example of this in Chicago, have really beautiful, minimalistic, almost Bauhaus level kind of design as a way to identify that they're different than the rest of craft beer at this point. And so we've kind of gone through multiple generations of that. And so when he described it as, beer should look quirkily amateurish, and kind of criticized some other ones as not being amateurish enough, it very much felt like a guy who took a very, almost like an alien landing on Earth and looking at craft beer kind of perspective on the thing, without kind of understanding, I think, how those things morphed over time and can kind of go any direction you want at this point.
So I'm curious, I don't know if you have any insight as far as Goose Island's current rebranding.
I think it's beautiful.
Yeah, but it definitely has a much younger, it seems like it's sort of targeting a younger culture, and these series that are coming out are abandoning that brand architecture that we're used to seeing, and I think in some of that detail, almost losing a little bit of that historic, like the little historic.
Thank God. Honestly, no, I think the branding that they've done in the past was very much influenced by a lot of English-style beer brands, which is what John Hall was influenced by. Fuller's was his sort of like primordial ooze of inspiration when he wanted to start up an urban brewery, and that sort of stretched oval kind of badge that he made very much looks like an old Scottish, Irish kind of English-style branding, and it just doesn't look relevant anymore. I mean, it looks old at this point. I think at the time it was very much like a line of credibility of some older branding. He made it look like not necessarily fancy beer, but maybe it looked like an import almost, which at the time was probably a pretty smart move, positioning yourself as a new craft brewer. What they've done now, I think, is they made themselves look like they are the brewery that they are, which is very relevant to sort of a younger, third wave kind of craft brewery. They're not trying to look tiny. They don't look like, they're not doing the quirkily amateurish thing that Lazar talks about at all. If anything, they're much more cleaned up. If you look at the spacing of the letters in the term Goose Island, it's very architecturally driven. It's very accurate and sort of consistent, and even the goose became much more refined looking and elegant. And I think that's trying to tell a story about their portfolio that's much broader than just Hunker's Ale, right? Now they have a vintage collection that's Sophie and the Sisters and BCS and things like that, so they're known as doing much more elegant, sort of sophisticated beers. So they're letting 312 kind of go one way, and then they're letting the rest of the collection go another. So they've been rebranding at multiple levels, and I think it's been really interesting. They hired VSA Partners in Chicago, which is a really extremely well-known design group here, not only nationally, but certainly in Chicago. Almost anybody who's a designer in Chicago has gone through that house at some point. And I think they did a bang-up job with it. And then the Illinois and the Ogden. I'm really curious about those because they did some like prairie-style kind of artwork for those that are really unusual. I don't know if that means a new segment of the portfolio for them. I don't know how they're thinking about those necessarily, but they just, I know that it looks very calculated, that decision. But what they actually did at VSA was they said anybody who wants to work on a new label for this one, go for it. And so 2 designers stayed through the weekend and worked on some stuff and came up with these ideas, and then they just ran with them. Which I guess is sort of that is the lack of the burden of expense at this point, which is really nice for them, but it turned out to be beautiful, beautiful artwork.
So with stores like Phineas, for example, the Lincoln Park Phineas had approximately 4,600 beer and cider SKUs on shelf last year. A little less than half of those were craft. So
terms of craft beer, consistency can be a great win at the shelf, but it can also become really boring at the same time. Nobody wants you to do the same thing forever. It's kind of built on the opposite, but I think what Solemn and even Lagunitas have done that's very unique in the industry is you've flipped the brand hierarchy a lot in some of your more popular shelf products. Is you see the word IPA before you ever see Lagunitas, and you see it from 20 feet away. You guys have done a similar thing with some of the artwork, and I would love to I would love to know about some of the decision making that went into that in terms of like you see the artwork and evil, and then Solemn Oath as a logo is tucked around on the side and very, very tiny. It's a risky move in craft beer where getting your name out there and getting it recognized is super important.
Sure. So, some of our labels, and we have an artist who is really into single color tattoo style illustration that almost looks like woodcut or etching, and the illustration is center on our label, and our logo is in two tiny places in the bottom right and bottom left corner. And for us, we package very little of our beer. You know, we package 2 batches a month when we're turning out, 9 to 10. So, about 20% of our beer or less is going out in bottles to the marketplace. And I think that is a huge factor when it comes to how you brand your beer, because we're a mostly draft brewery. How do we get our brand out there in the first place? We didn't do any bottles for the first year and a half of our existence. Now that we do, we've kind of established, I don't know, I hear this term from kind of the people we work with on our website or elsewhere, a design language. And I think our design language centers around that kind of illustration style. And there are like little cues that tell you that it's Solemn Oath. And it kind of fits in the hipster-ish design. And I know there have been blogs for many years now that bash hipster design, and that's cool, and I read them and they're hilarious and I laugh at them. But like arrows going through hands and like kind of like subtly dark and kind of creepy, weird, fantastical things that cue you into, this is our brand. But all of our labels are black and gray with silver metallic backing, and we let that backing kind of show through. And the reason we do this is because, on a shelf, you can stand out by being bright and vibrant, and you can kind of tell, oh, that's a Pipeworks box. Or they got Citron Ninja, let me get over there before this guy runs and grabs it before me. Or we kind of do the opposite, and we stand out by being more subdued. So we have this kind of rope design element that we play on some of the older elements of craft beer design, where we do have that elongated vertical oval that showcases the illustration, but it's not like a critter in a creek. It's like a Viking charging through somewhere looking really badass. Can I say badass? And given this impression that it's something that's a little more edgy, a little more young, and it's gonna be something that is gonna push you in some way. So our design language kind of appeals to that, the younger crowd, the younger culture, but it does so in a way that is really consistent. Our labels are way more consistent than Half Acres. I'd say they're probably as consistent as Lagunitas. They have a similar kind of style where you see Lagunitas label, the typography stays pretty similar. They have something that goes around the edge of the label that you're going to want to read because it's hilarious and it's going to draw you in and tell you some kind of cool, quirky story about what this beer is and what it's about that you're drinking this and instead of something else. And ours is really about the illustration because we think that it kind of stands on its own, and we have to give some life to these crazy, stupid names that we give to our beers. So the way we do that is we tell our artist what the name is, and he has kind of free reign to come up with whatever he thinks is going to attract people's attention to that. And I would be really curious to hear Phineas' take on this question as well. Sorry to put you on the spot.
I agree. I mean, I know that Half Acre has, certain beers that you're canning and distributing a little bit wider versus some of the bomber releases that last a day. So how is the approach different with those two types of situations?
Well, I guess we have had the luxury of worried about selling it. Like, whatever we make, somebody's going to drink it. That's not a question. We don't have to fight on a shelf and live and die in the the retail market. Yeah, we're still very small. We're getting bigger. So I guess we have tried to give all the cans a really strong graphic identity. Like they all stand out, I think, on their own as a can they are, although necessarily wouldn't see them as the same line because there's very little in the way of common elements between them. Because, I don't know, I don't like doing the same thing twice or like ever again once I've done it. And then the bombers and the draft releases are like totally their own thing. As you can see from just the stuff on the table over there, everybody gets to be whatever we decided. It'd be like, Gabriel gives me a name, I come up with this, we throw some stuff back and forth. I find out how much time I have to do it. I use all of that time to finish it and then send it off to the printer. Or it turns up as a small graphic on the website and nobody sees it again but me. I have a lot of draft designs that nobody but me even remembers.
So you make it sound very simple, but clearly there's a lot of detail that goes into the work that you do. So can you give us kind of an estimate of like how long does something like that take you to illustrate?
Oh gosh, it really depends between which thing we're talking about. Probably the longest one I've done is the last year's Big Hugs, because I don't know, there's like 12 dinosaurs on that thing. There's a lot of dinosaurs. I've been wanting to do a dinosaur beer, and it's like I'm gonna sneak one in, and then when I found my opening, it's like I'm gonna put them all in. I don't know when I'll get to do it again, so as many dinosaurs as possible. That was like a month of work. Yeah, that was like all painted in Photoshop. Basically like someone would do a oil or an acrylic or something like that, but no, not the comic book style inking or anything. So that was very slow. And then other things, even like some that I really like, I've had like a day to do more than once. I've like heard somebody in the office talking, saying about a beer that I've never heard of that's coming out in 2 days. Like, did you want something drawn for that? And yeah, so like a day and a half to come up with something finished for it. Not, obviously that doesn't get a printed label, but we try to have some kind of graphic for everything that we put out. So everything's got some kind of a hook usually. Very few haven't had some sort of a graphic to go with them.
So I noticed that each year Big Hugs has a different design. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit more on, as well as like Double Lazy Putter, what kind of drove the decision to keep evolving the label each time?
I guess it sort of just happened naturally, in that we had this character Big Hugs. And I did the first year, him like just destroying the building, and it was like a 60s Godzilla movie with a giant fluffy kitty. And then they were going to do it again, and obviously we can't just do the same thing again. And like Gabriel came up with like completely out of left field. I want Big Hugs kicking over a castle in like fairyland. I would never go with that. So that was the first year of Angry Hugs. And he was super cute, happy Hugs the first year. Then he was angry, destroying Hugs, smashing the rainbow. And the next year he was destroying the North Pole. But he wasn't destroying it because he was mad. It was because he loved Santa so much. And he was hugging everything and destroying it because he was just a giant doofus. And so at that point, like, all right, we've got a character and we've got a narrative. We've done 3 of these. And so now we're just like daring ourselves. What's Big Hugs going to do this time? And I don't know what's going to happen next year at all. Literally no idea. And the same with, it happened sort of in the same accidental way with the double daisy cutter donkeys is they keep needing new things to do. So we keep sending them on strange adventures. It keeps me off the street.
Tony, I'm curious about something. So you own one of the country's largest breweries. It would be very easy for you to hire a graphic designer. You got two on stage right here.
I've heard.
You still design all of the labels and write all of the copy,
Yeah.
right?
Yep, I do.
So what drives the passion to want to do that?
Well, if I can say something else first,
Yeah.
I'll stand up. My name is Tony Magee. I have a brewery that was founded circa 1991.
Woo!
It's in the town, it's named after the town it was in. There is a creek named Lagunitas Creek. And I want to share this last part with you. There's a critter on the label. Anyway, I guess, where are we? Yes, I still do all the labels, and you know, I did them in the early days, not because I was a designer, but I did have a little design experience, training. I studied for a year down at the Magee New Bauhaus School of Design at IIT, and the fundamentals of Bauhaus were burned into my mind. The first year, all that we did was two-dimensional design, even though it was product design I was studying. And we only worked in black and white the whole damn year. So you really learned about space and function of the flow of space, and how typography in particular was probably the most powerful design element, at least in that ethos. The second year we would have gotten into color, but I didn't stay a second year. I went out to the music school so I could get extra high, which I succeeded in doing and dropped out of. But that design ethos was all that I really had to fall back on. And when we first started the brewery, I had a friend who was a very, very skilled San Francisco designer, and he did a label for me that was very, very conventional. And I didn't know anything about even how to use Adobe Illustrator, but I didn't have enough money to hire a real designer, and I felt bad about going back and asking him a second time. So I would take his files to Kinko's, put it into they had Adobe Illustrator on those computers, and I would just poke at it until I found out how to select things and found out how it works. And then I kept 3 of his typefaces, and those 3 typefaces are still present on every label today. And I just kind of tried to develop a vocabulary of shapes. Originally they were just in black and white, and I added color. Got the nerve to, you know. But that was, and then the stories that are on there were just a way, not so much, you know, in the early days of when the brewery first started out, there was a catalog out there. It was the J. Peterman catalog. It became an enormous joke on Seinfeld and eventually went away. But what was so brilliant about that thing was that they would have a jacket, just a hand drawing of a jacket, but next to it was a story not about the jacket or who made it or who designed it or where it came from or even what material it was made of, what color, none of that. It would be a story about, there'd be a jacket on the right hand side, and on the left side that would be saying something about the author sat at a small table in Marrakesh smoking one of those really strong cigarettes that you could only get in that part of the world. He was worried about a negotiation going on down the hall. He picked his jacket up off and he walked, you know, I mean, it would be a place where that jacket might have been, that would have been beyond kind of apprehension. And so I tried to do that with the stories. Just the idea of looking backwards. I mean, you guys are, you know, you're very involved in the world of design, and contemporary ideas are powerful, but and they connect and people understand the language. But I remember Bob Dylan years and years ago saying, someone compared one of his albums to a Bruce Springsteen album, and he's like, you know, first of all, I don't copy anything under 50 years old. And so, you know, I've applied that too. So I only want to look for the oldest of old ideas and find something new within that ethos. So. And by doing it myself all the time, I mean, I wrote the recipes up until just recently, and so the brand had a recognizable voice. And that's the thing, you know, that everyone's talked about, is how to create something that has enough connective tissue to it, that people recognize that it's coming from the same source. So if they trusted you then, they'll trust you in the future. And that's that little vocabulary of images that I have is what I use.
So I think that's kind of a great segue into, as you grow and as you're now expanding across the country, how do you hold on to that consistent voice?
Well, because I do those things, there's no such thing as a creative brief. There's no such thing as an agency change that yields people who want to bring their own suchness to the conversation. The voice is intact. One day I'll be gone and somebody else will have to decode what the elements were, and they'll possibly try to bring their own voice to that. And then the Lagunitas brand will drift. This is how things work, It's very hard to do like what you guys do, where you're working with an artist and you're all trying to align your voices all the time, and sometimes you want exactly the same things and sometimes you don't. But that brand has to be a forever thing. And so for me, as the brewery's gotten bigger and bigger, and this sounds trite, but it's totally true, my role in the brewery has gotten smaller and smaller and increasingly focused on things that matter more and more. And so I have more time than ever to work on labels and to think about names and to think about copy and stories and the nature of how we try to show people what we think is cool.
So with the number of employees that you have, and obviously all those employees are, hitting the streets, having contact with consumers, you have distributors involved, is there like a Tony 101 workshop? Like how do you kind of...
They take a quart of my blood every week. Hopefully it's been screened, but this is something, what you're hitting the nail on the head though, it's very hard. That's a hard part. So for me, the business gets smaller and smaller, so the voice gets clearer and clearer and easier to describe. But then I have to really trust, what are essentially my first lieutenants, to carry that message to the next people. And in Chicago, we hired 75 people, and already there were 4 or 5 of them. We just realized that what they wanted to do was reimagine our brand in their own image, and it wasn't going to work. And so we had to make changes. So we're always looking for people who are willing, and willing is a big part of. You come with a lot of pride and a lot of ego, and you want to bring your own thing to it, and you sure. But until you're ready to do your own thing, there's somebody else's voice you have to speak in. My father's second wife, she wrote for Forbes and she wrote for the Wall Street Journal. She had to write in 2 completely different voices, neither of which were her own to do that job. So that's one thing that we spent a lot of time trying to show people, who are entering the brewery, who we are. It's like we figured that 80% of the people who work at the brewery now have been there 3 years or less. So it takes but then there's a handful of us who've been there for 20,
And the challenge of trying to maintain that brand identity in some kind of consistent manner is made even more difficult by the fact that people need freshness, right? So I did Two Brothers brand identity maybe 15 years ago, 12 years ago, and 3-4 years ago, Jason's like, yeah, well, time to redo it. And that's just the cycle of things. We tried to keep a feel and tried to keep some continuity. But those brands need refreshing. Sierra was kind of in a trough, I think about 4 or 5 years ago. The brand was getting kind of stale and pretty static, and they did what they needed to freshen it up and push it forward without losing any of the thing. The other thing is that for most breweries, there are multiple stratified lines. So you have your main line, you may have a fun casual line that might be in cans, you may have a like 312 would be that. Then you have a step-up line that's big bottles, maybe somewhat special beers, $10, $15 beers, and then sometimes you have even a third line that's even higher or above that. So and all that does, ideally you'd like that to hang together. So it becomes kind of a big puzzle to make it all work.
I mean, 10 to 15 years is sort of like, that used to be about the lifespan of a brand before you need to refresh it in one way or another, right? But the craft beer happening as fast as it does now, staying relevant, if you're a new brand in a category, you kind of have to constantly be adjusting, not necessarily to be like anybody else, but to constantly make sure that you're staying interesting or different or being true to yourself in some unique way. And I mean, Five Rabbit was 3 years old before we started working on that from a brand and strategy standpoint in terms of reconcepting what that portfolio looked like and what it meant to people and who was drinking our beer and what we wanted to make. And I think that was a fascinating exercise. Only 3 years in. I mean, the brew house itself had only been about a year old, and we were already starting to ask big questions about the future of that brand, and we got to do some cool stuff.
Would you mind if I rebut that? We just offered another way to look at the same thing. Rolling Stones could come out with an album tomorrow, and it would be vaguely different than the ones that came out with 20 years ago, and yet it would be as compelling and central and the fundamental human humanity in it would be obvious. I mean, we have the IPA label is exactly the same as it was for me 20 years ago. I think I darkened up the drop shadow around the outside edge once. And now, if you, and then this is the hard part of developing a brand, is you have to be willing to, like, you know, kind of put your own creative vision aside, create some rules for yourself. And in my case, it was to find a deep enough root that it would, the root itself would feed the tree for as long as the tree would need to exist. And then the question is like saying that a brand's visual vocabulary has gotten tired is really like saying, the English language is so tired. I think we should just start speaking Mandarin. I mean, I'm so tired of verbs and adverbs and dangling gerunds. I think that what the problem is what these brands do with that voice, rather than it is the voice itself. Because a voice that stays the same becomes eminently recognizable over time. And that's the most powerful thing you can have. It's a platform from which to communicate with people from. And that's what a brand is supposed to be for. It's a way to communicate. It's a way for the brand authors to be understood. As simple as that.
Well, Tony, I had to point out, we're at very different breweries, from Lagunitas to Solemn and Acre. At some point, volume is a big part of your brand, right? If you can get a Lagunitas IPA at every bar on Division Street versus having to seek out a beer somewhere because you know this brewery and love it and want to find what's new, versus having something stable that's rooted and established and grown over time and nourished and well loved to the point where people in different parts of the country that don't have a personal connection with your brand love that beer, want to drink it over and over again because you've made something that's tasty and delicious and affordable and what people want to drink.
Well, okay, to that, you're completely right. I mean, I have every advantage in the world. But one of the reasons why I have every advantage in the world, I think, if I'm to try to be humble about it, not try to own it, is to say that it's because, like, we were doing exactly these same things back when they weren't good ideas. And it took 20 years for us to get to the point where these things are recognizable. When I first did the IPA label, I remember people saying, Pyramid was doing very beautiful, very graphically based labels. Red Hook was this big, powerful set of colors, and Full Sail had piles of. These brands aren't even around anymore. Portland Brewing, the Henry Weinhardt stuff. This was all every six-pack looked like a little circus car on the shelf. And instead I said, when everyone's digging, I'm going to zag. I'm going to go for the oldest, most profound, least likely to have to change look. And it wasn't popular. I remember people saying that, God, your brand just looked like generic beer, And when I heard people say that, I was like, I didn't even really care if people loved it or if they hated it. What I wanted was people to have some opinion of it. But for people to have an opinion of it, in my mind, I wanted to make it simpler so that they could just get on with hating it if that's what they had to do. But they weren't going to remember it, and at some point I would have another chance to meet those folks down the road.
I think that's a brilliant strategy. I mean, I think what I hear in that kind of conversation is that there's not one way to do it. A brand that started when you did and wanting to be different, like you reacted to things that were in the market, things that were in people's heads, stuff that you were familiar with. I mean, Rolling Stone magazine was an icon at the time. And I would say that your branding actually kind of follows suit a little bit. It follows not only the look, but also the strategy of where that existed in the marketplace at the time. And I would say that what a brand tends to have to do now in the current marketplace where Solemn is fighting is adaptability, relevance, constantly trying to be new. That is the brand of craft brewery today. Trying to do something that like throws back and is classical and unchanging today would be a very difficult sell. I'm not saying it would be a bad idea, but it would be a difficult one for sure. Those are just two different strategies.
Well, it was different when we did it, but it was a long-term strategy. And, having said that, Lagunitas is 13 years old before it showed its first positive cash flow year. But I think that we sowed seeds.
It's also a matter of your constraints. I mean, you went to Kinko's and fired up Adobe Illustrator for the first time. Don't try and tell me that you would have done something like Phineas did, but you didn't feel like it.
No, I couldn't have. There was no way I could have. I couldn't even come close to that, that's for sure. I mean, those things are beautiful. I don't mean to disparage it at all. Just say that there's like a bunch of different ways to skin the apple. And you meet with two designers here on the stage, three designers, right? It's like, the notion of change is a powerful one because, well, that's the business you're in, trying to read the tea leaves and see that future just before it gets here, so you can help your customers be there. But there's another way to skin that cat, and that is to reach for the oldest, most iconic set of images you can find, and then you get to like relax for a while and let the world change around you, you know. And eventually, yes, of course, you have to respond, you have to catch up. But sometimes I think it's more the things you do with that brand than the things that the brand itself shows. You know?
I totally agree. And I think
Look at
actually,
Corona. Look at Maker's Mark. You know, look at this was actually where the inspiration for our label came from, was Maker's Mark. You know, I would look at. Thank you very much. I'm not even halfway there. But Maker's Mark is one of the, at the time of his first presentation, was one of the nicest whiskeys on the shelf, commonly found, and it was the crummiest fucking label anyone ever seen. I see that casting against type sometimes, you know, it's like if you make Cary Grant the bad guy for the first scene, the movie is stressful, you know, something's wrong. You know?
I think it also goes back to what you want to make from the beer standpoint, right? Like when I think of Lagunitas, I think IPA and I think Pils, because those icons are just, I mean, they're omnipresent at this point in craft beer circles, at least.
Excellent.
It is excellent. If I'm Solemn, the last thing I'm trying to do is make the same beer an icon in everybody's daily life. Every beer I make is different. And so change and adaptability becomes not only core to my brand or my logo or my strategy, it's what I'm actually making as well. And I think that's a major difference in not only brand strategy, but product strategy as well.
I'd love to hear from Randy and from Micheal just about the role that culture is playing with Five Rabbit. How much work are you doing to educate consumers on what that influence is, or are you fine with it just being sort of a layer of design or a layer of influence in recipes?
Well, salsa's the new ketchup, right? So that's sort of our starting point. We had originally thought that we really would have quite a market in Latinos, and we certainly have the upperly mobile, we do well-educated second, third generation Chicago, but the market as the larger market is more conservative and changing slowly, and they're kind of not really that much into craft beer. And so we always had a dual market strategy of reaching out to Latinos and doing what we could to get that business, but knowing that our bulk of our business is going to be coming through people who like craft beer, but also like the flavors that you get in Mexican food. So we consciously tried to create a brand image that was reflective of Latin culture, but at the same time not stealing anything from it. We didn't want any traditional kind of Mexican things. Our idea from the very beginning was to be pan-Latin, because at the time we had one partner from Mexico and another from Costa Rica, and his wife was from Peru. So we had kind of a mix, and still do in our group. And so we try and give the beers and the labels a kind of a Latin sensibility without you being able to put your finger on any one thing and saying, oh yeah, that's that Latin thing. Right? So that's a little more difficult, but I think it gives us a broader appeal. The labels are generally kind of upbeat and fun, and we definitely like to have them look handcrafted. And a lot of the typography is I actually do I'll do it on a scratch board about the size of a postage stamp with a magnifying glass, and then scan it at 2400 dpi and blow it up and trace it out and cut and correct it, because you get a kind of a chunky, funky kind of textural quality to it that you can't get by picking a typeface. I mean, I almost never go to a typeface for anything important on anything I do. It's all sort of hand done on everything I do, really, but Five Rabbit especially. And then, with Michael's help, we launched that new Gringolandia brand, and the goal there was to have something that was more kind of Lagunitas-like, I guess, for lack of a better word, something that was definitely reflective of the craft beer sphere, specifically.
We said, let's take some IPA tap handles.
Yeah, we're gonna knock off. We're gonna get all the Tony. Well, no, but I mean to be more reflective of the craft beer look as a whole, more stripped down, less obviously Latino, less storytelling, less myths and fables, and more nuts and bolts, I guess.
Yeah, I guess I would describe it as, so anytime you do a brand strategy, especially with an existing product line, there's there's a lot of factors that go into it. It's not just the look, it's not just the story. I mean, what we were looking at was velocity on certain brands, the expense of making some of those beers and the margins you could actually make off of them. I mean, 300 limes into a beer and a bunch of wheat, like that stuff adds up pretty quickly. And so we were looking at it from a lot of different ways. And how can we start to broaden what we were making at Five Rabbit at both high and low end in terms of price and velocity? And so the Gringolandia series is very much targeted at occasional drinking where you were going to have 3 or 4 of them. And we realized that the audiences for those are probably different than the people drinking Five Vulture or Five Rabbit, potentially. And so what we were looking for there was a beer that people would connect to emotionally in a very different way than they would to with the sort of old Aztec myths of Five Grass and Five Vulture like had previously existed. And so we said, well, what if we just take those and we call them the Fives and we start looking in other areas, other ways to play with not only the recipe but the storytelling, and maybe not tell stories from Aztec, ancient sort of Latin America. What if we told stories that looked like they were from Latin America now? And I mean, obviously we have this enormous benefit in Andres Araya actually being from Costa Rica to be able to tap into some of those icons, some of those storytelling, some of the sense of humor that Andres has. He's kind of a reserved guy. He's never really stepped out as sort of the face of the brewery or as the voice of the brewery all that much. He's been sort of behind the scenes. But he's very much, he is Five Rabbit. And so we kind of looked to his sense of humor, a little bit of his irreverence, and we started to realize that there was an entire section we could carve out to tell a story called Gringolandia. We eventually named it. To get it a little bit more of the sense of humor, have some fun with it. Beers like a Super Pils and a Fabulous Order. Beers that are sort of familiar to people, slightly tweaked in the style of Five Rabbit, but that we could do with a visual and a verbal language that was a little bit more fun, less serious, less storytelling, and more of a sort of almost like an inside joke in a way.
Well, a lot of it was just driven by a desire to have a better amount of sales on draft. Tap handles suck. Right? Tap handles are the single most difficult thing that any graphic designer can ever deal with. They're impossible. You did a really good job, Tony. You have 3-letter words that are really big, and you can see them from a mile away, and that's almost nobody has that. And hey, you got to get the job done, right? So having beers that were referenced to existing styles, even if they didn't copy. It's a Super Pils. It's not a Pils. It's an IPA with Pilsner ingredients. But people kind of think they know what it is, whereas our other beers, you need the label to tell the story. And then once they figure it out, they like it, but it's too much.
And the simplicity of that experience comes through. Our goal was to tell a completely different story than the Fives, which are very layered artwork. It almost looks like watercolor. Lots of sort of layers on top of each other, and the names, they call back to myth. Super Pils, Fabulous a Porter, it's Pils and a Porter, with some very simple sort of inside joke Spanish names in front of them. And even the artwork is very, very flat and two-dimensional looking. It's just a solid color with black graphic. I think you would cut those, didn't you? Yeah. And so it's a similar process, but a very completely different sort of presentation to the consumer. It looks simple, fun, and sort of easily accessible for the styles that they are, which is appropriate.
Yeah, and we're starting to build up, we have all these little icons on there. They're just like little thumbnail-sized icons. And we're starting to build up a new, we're just going to keep adding to them. So on one of the new beers we're working on, I added a pothole as one of the symbols.
Honestly, it's not that different than I think what I see on like the Pony Pils can, right? It's a much more sort of simple, easily identifiable kind of iconic character. The word Pils is pretty large on there, whereas Pony Pils, right? Whereas a lot of the other artwork is much more layered, intricate, kind of like it draws you in. I don't know, those kind of things relate to the actual beer in the bottle to me.
Well, cans are difficult just because the printing process in cans is very comic book kind of quality,
So I'd love to shift gears a little bit and kind of talk to Katie about storytelling in a 3D space. So last year you brought Dry Hops Taproom to light. The description was my father's workshop on a good day. They had a logo that they were using. Can you talk a little bit about the process of how you took their vision and brought that to life in the taproom?
Yeah, I think that what it comes down to, and I think what we're all kind of getting at with all of this, is that you have to be true to who you are, and you have to be true to what your brand is, and those are like the key points that you have to know going into everything. And if you don't know those going into everything, you're probably not going to be that successful, but if you do and you stay true to yourself, you're probably going to be pretty successful because you're going to have those guiding principles, that design language, that vocabulary that you're using to sort of extra stuff. And that's what we do with, with dry hop space as well, is that's exactly what we were given from Greg. It was my father's workshop on a good day. And so, your mind can kind of just go crazy with it. But ultimately, it was this feeling. It was a feeling of warmth, of comfort. He wanted everybody to feel come in there, not just the people that loved craft brew and understood all the process, but the guys walking down the street that wanted to just grab a good beer. And I think that was kind of the driving force, was creating that overall feeling and that overall sort of environment, rather than pinpointing on certain elements or characteristics or key things. I don't know who that is.
You're amazing.
Thanks. Yeah, but so what we wanted to do is we actually kind of wanted to tell the story of beer, and so what we kind of wanted to do was lead people through the process. And so that's why when you walk in there, you see all of the brewing process on stage, basically. So you can see everything from them first starting the batch to its aging to its burn-out cap right there. And that's the kind of the cool part about your space, is that it's completely start to finish process right there. And that was the biggest part, was just sort of putting that on view, making it comfortable, making it warm. And then we played with materials a little bit as well to sort of hone in on that. My father's workshop on a good day, a little more polished. But it was truthfully, it was the warmth and it was that communality that you wanted in the space, more than I want bread in here, or I want wood in here, or whatever those distinctive features are.
Getting to a phrase like my father's workshop on a good day is an impossible task for most people. It's kind of, and I know how hard they worked on that, because otherwise people get distracted by the million decisions you're supposed to make about the space or about the can, right? Like, I need this, I need this, I need this, but they don't have that phrase in their head of like what it is they're actually going for.
Yeah.
It just becomes a nightmare.
Yeah.
If they open another space, could I suggest my father's workshop on a bad day? Because I would be interested in seeing that. More blood on the floor.
And the comments you made about knowing who you are, anybody who works with clients, that's the first job, right? I did the identity and labels for Metropolitan, and Doug and Tracy came to me, I don't know, 7, 8 years ago, whenever they started, and they came to me with Alchemy Brewing Company. And I said, okay, great, what's that to you? He's like, I don't know, we just thought it would be cool. And I go away. Come back when you have something that has meaning. There's nothing wrong with alchemy, but it was just sort of arbitrary. So they thought about it for a while. Her family's in the metalworking business. They make dumpsters and do a lot of stuff like that. And they came back with that idea of Metropolitan and the gutsy Chicago metalworking kind of industry sort of thing. It's like, okay, now we got something we can work with. So that was the nucleus of that. And sometimes you never get that. Sometimes in kind of corporate type people, it's like, oh no, just do whatever will sell the most. It's like, no. Who are you? What do you like to wear? What do you like to do? What do you care about? What do you hate?
Well, that's something I'd love to dig a little deeper into, because I think, for a lot of the breweries starting out, their focus is on the beer and the recipes. So what are the questions that you would ask them? What are the things that they can ask themselves to further define who they are and how they want to differentiate themselves?
Well, how are you going to be different? What's special about your beer? There's a million beers on the market. Why are yours different? What do you like? What do you care? What music do you listen to? What car do you drive? You just got to dig down. Where'd you come from? Who are your people? It's a million questions, and it could be a different answer for everybody. It doesn't have to be any one thing. And you could even make it up. And it's like, I like a completely goofy, made-up story. It's like, great, we can work with that. But it's got to have something that comes from somewhere.
I usually go party with them. So I just kicked off a project with a new startup in Indianapolis. And the first question they had was like, when can we come up to Chicago and meet in your studio and start talking about some of these ideas? Which sounded like the worst way to get to know these guys ever. So instead, I hopped in my car and on a Monday night, I drove down to Indianapolis, and we just went out of the town, and they showed me their favorite bars, they showed me their favorite beers, we went to bottle shops, they introduced me to friends of theirs, and it gave me a really great sense of who they are as people. And then when we went back the next day and we talked about the beers they're making and the kind of stuff that they're interested in, and They showed me the future space, which is going to be kind of interesting. I had all of these sort of tangible things to draw on, which are very similar to the tangible things that they draw on. Because people can tell you, even my dad's workshop on a good day is a great starting place. But my dad's workshop on a good day was still pretty rough, right? He didn't really do much down there. It was almost like a showpiece. So everybody sort of has a different interpretation of what those things mean, and that's really hard if you're working from the outside in to help somebody articulate their vision, is actually getting to what that vision really is. And the more you can get that firsthand, the better. And I think it even works when I work with Solemn on stuff like the launch up in Wisconsin. We went up to make a video there, and I could not have done what we did had we not gone up together. And had a great time in Milwaukee and a great time in Madison. Shook hands with the same people and drank beers with the same people. Coming out of that, we all have the same story to tell, or at least it's approximated more closely. And I think that's kind of the key to making something that delivers on. Because not only is it going to be our collective vision in the end, but it's going to be something that Solemn owns. It's not just going to be something that an agency made for them, which I think is usually where craft beer design and marketing falls flat, is when you hire an agency to give you a recommendation, and then a year from now, you're just like, you know what, this is kind of vacant. All they did was some old vintage type, and I thought we looked cool for a minute, and now it's boring again. Because you don't own it. It's not yours. It's not coming from your experiences. I think it takes embedding with that team.
Going up to Wisconsin has been really interesting. So, how many of you guys in the room know a Windy City person? Anybody works for Windy City Distributing? All right. So you meet your Windy City guys. They're like, "Sup? Pull all this shit off. Allagash White, Lagunitas IPA. Let's go. How we doing?" All right. You go up to Wisconsin, and our sales team has been selling liquor. All right. And beer salespeople and liquor salespeople are really, really different. So we go to Wisconsin, and we show up, and our guys are, they show up in a button-down tee, or a button-down shirt, slacks, and a tie. And we have this brand that we built that's mostly around the idea that you're talking to your best friend that you love giving a hard time to, right? And that's our voice that we take on with our customers, because that's how we feel most comfortable, and that's how we talk to each other. And when it starts to get into a new territory, into a new place, and more out of your hands, the brand just becomes a little more, a little less manageable than it was before. Right. So, they know what we're about. They see our art. They see what we write. They see the visuals we put out in front of the world, and they're supposed to translate that into sales for us. And we could sell all the beer we make in Chicago right now. There's no capacity reason we had to go to Wisconsin. It's not even a surplus of beer. No, Windy City's asking us for more beer all the time. So going up there was because, this goes down to a lot of personal relationships. The reason that craft beer is such a meaningful thing for people is because there are these really strong, deep relationships between the people who own the companies, the people who make the beer, the bartenders behind the bar who we know on a first-name basis across the city, and that's how we built this from day one. But our owners, John and Joe, grew up in Mequon, just north of Milwaukee, and their family's up there, and they have a lot of friends up there, and they wanted their beer to be served in this area where all these people they know and love live. So going up there meant for us sacrificing a big degree of control over our brand, where Windy City really speaks our language and understands who we are and can say to people, this is, who Solemn is. And no, they're not going to give you the same beer over and over again. Every week they're going to have something different. And if you want to put them on, you want to have a Solemn handle, well, you got to be open to this idea that it's not going to be the same beer all the time. It's definitely not going to be the same beer all year. But they'll give you stuff that's interesting, that's quality, that's well made, and we'll give it to you in the quantities that kind of you need. And you go to a new place, and you're entering a totally different game. The ground rules are different. Kind of everything about selling your beer in a new territory changes how you're doing it. And then you get into the fact that certain distributors have sister distributors in different states, and the second tier of the industry really has a lot to do with how the beer gets from the brewery to you. The wholesaler is a huge factor in kind of what happens. But at the same time, we try to maintain a really direct link with our customers and talk to people directly and have a conversational tone. I mean, like, shit, we're people. We're people. We can talk to each other. We don't have to have this like weird pie in the sky, like third person brand language to talk to you in. Like, we want to have a beer with you and drink with you face to face, and that's kind of what we want to get across to you in our messaging. And when you get to be bigger and you have a company that employs hundreds and hundreds of people, which we're nowhere close to, I wonder, how do we keep that fresh? How do we stay true to that? Because when it comes down to it, a big part of how we think about ourselves is that we can go out and go walk in any bar with the Solemn Brew and make a bunch of friends and have a great time and have fun stories to kick around years from now. That's not always going to be true. So we haven't figured out yet, what that is, what that next step, how we translate our very small, intimate brand into something that scales. So I'd be very interested to hear from Tony and Randy about, brands that scale, that get there. And Phineas too, so you guys are ready to go through your
Find out how to
big,
scale.
chunky growth here. So.
Oh, how do you scale? I don't know. We made 6,000 barrels last year at Five Rabbits, so. I mean, I think it's just being in charge of that message, that you can't always be there for your brand. I mean, and it's a conundrum because we are in an industry where we have that personal touch, and we go to festivals and we pour beer and talk about our beers and shake people's hands and relate, and Anheuser-Busch can't do that at all. But at the same time, as Paul says, once that beer leaves your brewery, you've got other people taking care of it. So having a really strong message that's really clearly laid out, that everybody can understand how to talk about the beer, that the packaging delivers that message, that it's really well thought out so that it engages people. It does a lot of, good packaging, good branding does a lot of that work for you because you can't always be right there with the beer telling the story. You'd sell a lot more beer if you had a person with every six-pack, to go along with it, but it just doesn't happen that way.
And it gets corrupted quickly. You didn't get to hear this when we were up there, but we were in a bar just outside of Madison. It was the first day they were tapping one of your kegs, and they didn't know that we were from Solemn. And we overheard the bartender, somebody asked the bartender, "Oh, what's that handle?" They'd never seen it before. She'd taken off a New Glarus handle and put a Solemn on it. She said, "We've got the video to prove it." And she said, "Oh, they're called Solomon Oath. They're this kind of edgy brewery from Illinois." That was the end of the pitch. We gave her a poster afterwards with the skeleton riding the horse carcass with wings carrying the cow that was milking over the city. And we brought her up to speed pretty quickly, but that's how fast, day one, it was wrong. Wrong name and kind of edgy. That might be true, I don't know.
But that's the pitch. You need like one name and one sentence, and if a brewery doesn't make sense in that short of a sentence, you're going to have a really hard time getting the message out.
Tony, you have a pretty good presence on Twitter. As a brewery that started, before social media had a big impact, can you talk a little bit about how that's helped Lagunitas and Paul also with the sob stories? Like, how do you utilize social media to, continue to tell the story of your brands?
Well, with Lagunitas, we were open, it was probably 2002 before we had email. Yeah. And because I like the idea of brewing as a Bronze Age business, We were there in the middle of, the whole the .com bomb in the making, and the neighborhood around us was turning into what they called at the time Telecom Gulch, and the city of Petaluma really didn't even want us there. We were like this weird, messy, smelly thing that engendered a lot of traffic, and there was wastewater and stuff, and meanwhile all around us, Cisco and Fiber Lane, and this endless parade of next .com, Tel, something or others, and the city preferred them. And ironically, when 2008 came along, it was like all those guys just folded up their laptops and left. But by that time, I poured about 10,000 yards of concrete, so we weren't going anywhere, So anyway, coming up in that time, we didn't have any social media. as part of the business's ethos. And it's really just in the last few years that we sort of got like the last 2 or 3 years, we got a Facebook site going. Because we've been doing our marketing kind of like belly to belly, you know, hand to hand, and trying to build relationships in the ways that, and it's sort of an old school way. And what's interesting is we kind of waited out the social media thing, I think, long enough that when we finally engaged with it, it was like there's a certain pent up expectation that we'd be delivering some stuff. And I started doing that frickin' Twitter thing, and you know, actually I did it when, like, you know, my marriage started falling apart for like the 3rd, 5th, 10th, I don't know. And one morning I woke up on a Saturday and I loaded my 2 dogs into a motorhome that I bought. This is like 2010 I bought it for $12,000 and I just drove off, you know. And I opened a Twitter account. It's a long story. But back then I had an iPhone, and so it was like you can run the business from any place. And so I drove off in this motorhome, and I decided to open a Twitter account just as sort of an ongoing journal more than anything else. I mean, so I don't follow anybody on Twitter, which is counter to everything. And I just a couple days ago, it ticked over to 19,500 followers. And there's a lot of craft brewery guys who have the tens of thousands. In fact, the Lagunitas Brewhouse Twitter feed has like 60-some thousand followers. It's a big number. So it's still modest, but it's interesting that people follow. They follow for a reason. And since there's no dialogue and I don't answer the people's tweets, you can read it, like go all the way back to the first day as if it was a bit of a diary. And I always try to write in code because I thought 140 characters was sort of like enforced haiku. You know, most people like have blogs, and the original comprehension. I think the original the incarnation of Twitter was as a microblog, and so I wanted to treat it like a blog, not as a way to talk to people, but as a way just a tiny radio station. And then when I announced the Chicago Brewery, it was like I picked up 5,000 followers overnight. My phone has a little alert, and it was beeping, on the little bell going off all night long. And it's just become a way to talk to people. But I think as much as talking to people, it's like become a great way to talk to the press. And people will pick up things directly verbatim off the Twitter feed. And so that has both taught me the power of it and also the danger of it, you know? Because I was just saying things that were, as far as I could tell, true. And the stuff that kind of, it was hard for me in the day-to-day of the business. They weren't marketing pieces, but the media mistook them for marketing pieces. And, you know, authenticity matters. Everyone in the audience just scratches the chin, authenticity, yeah. But being authentic, the word authentic has the word, I thought about it a lot, has the word author buried in it. If you're the author of your own story, you're by definition authentic. And so I try to keep it, you know, authentic by like kind of focusing on trying to, you know, Hemingway would write about, you know, all he wanted to do in his career was just write one true sentence. And a lot of times with the brewery, it's that. A lot of the kind of the hand-wringing, you know, about how to create a brand and what do you want to tell people and how do you communicate what you think is important. I have a feeling that people start, you know, people manage later, they manage breweries, you know, steward management that shows up like the second generation and down the road. They manage it based on the artifacts that are left behind by the founders. But like this is a special time in history right now. The founders of these breweries, this hasn't happened since the 1860s, 1870s. This is like being around in Elizabethan England when Spencer and Marlowe were reinventing the English language, you know. Or the 1770s hanging around drinking with, you know, George and Ben and John, you know, and all of the would-be presidents. And so this is a special time now, and the things that we say, you know, are the things that will be remembered and become the body of the brand. And I really think that a lot of people start breweries today, it's just a desire to be understood, right? So you start with the liquid as a way to be understood, but then you realize you need a label, and the label will tell stories about the liquid that you want to be understood. And it's the most fundamental of human needs. And so that's what I've always tried to do, is put it out there in a way that was not personal, but was universal enough for other people to respond to.
Yeah, so everybody who brews at or owns or is a part of a craft brewery, fucking weird. There are no like people who are just like your run-of-the-mill, like gonna walk down a straight line kind of a life. Who works at a craft brewery? It just doesn't happen. So I think that's why we have such an appeal to so many people who are out there, you know, working day jobs in IT or whatever. And I know a couple of them in this room right now, 2 of them who are starting their own craft beer ventures. everybody wants to be a part of this thing where you get to kind of express who you are. And that's something at Solemn Oath where we take kind of beyond the beer and the label, and we're trying to figure out to what extent can we tell our story that's not even about the beer we're making that people still care about. Right, I wrote a story on our company blog last summer about a vacation I took to South Dakota, and I visited one brew pub in Custer, South Dakota while I was out there. They didn't come up once in the piece, right? It was about kind of this travel and what it meant to me, and it didn't really tie back to the beer we were making at all. But our other brewer, Matt, wrote a piece, which Walking Dead character is each person in the brewery and why. And he wrote another piece about, how the brewery started. And the brewery started in the 1880s when he could find some historical stock footage that was copyright free and could Photoshop all of our heads onto it. And that's how the brewery started and why. And, there's so much room to play with, what your brand is and why your beer should matter to anybody. And I think Micheal has really nailed it with his motto for Good Beer Hunting, and the greatest beer is one that you actually care about. So with all of the breweries out there right now, it doesn't matter if you're making hundreds of thousands of barrels or a couple hundred or a couple thousand, give people a reason to care. Why does this matter? Why should I give you the time of day when I could plop my $10 down on this bomber versus the next, when I could spend a night drinking this IPA versus the other? Why am I going to drink yours? And where am I going to be able to, on the brewery side, where am I going to be able to, where do I have opportunities to convince people that they like us because we're fun, or they like us because they did a beer that was the name and the label was related to some Weird Al movie that I really love more than anything else. Just give people the opportunities to connect and share their weirdness with each other. It's kind of what we're all about at the end of the day. We're all pretty weird in this room. Who's not weird? Is anybody not weird in here? No. Oh, yeah, two not weird people. Get out of here!
Something that you were kind of getting at that's really important to me is, especially in the early stages of a brand, is clearing enough way with your brand that you can kind of get away with anything in the future. Never let it, people I think get obsessed with this idea of brand management, right? And the idea that a brand stands for these things, it can never change, and it has to be that way forever. What I see that are people that are being really smart with their companies now and their brand and the people that are involved is they keep finding a way to reinvent it in a way that gives them permission to do anything they want without being off-brand, whatever that means, right? When it's based in authorship, and I think that's the most important word of that, it really comes down to, well, if it makes sense for that person, then it makes sense for the brand. And we are in this golden age where the people that are behind these brands are still alive and still running those things. And I love that your hands are on those things as they go out the door, either writing the copy or messing with the label. But even when we were talking earlier tonight, I was asking you the question about Half Acre because I didn't know the history very well. I said they used to kind of have this static look, right? It was Half Acre was a very static sort of brand. It was very consistent, but it was a little bit boring in the very beginning. I was like, but then all of a sudden it seemed like they were just playing with it in every direction. And now I feel like I still know what Half Acre looks like, but it would almost be impossible to describe it to somebody because it looks so different all the time. And that was when you took over.
It looks like this.
I'm curious what it was like in those first moments when you inherited this brand, because there's not a lot of people that inherit brands in craft brewing these days. And how did you break it open again?
Well, so the thing is, I had no idea that I'd inherited a brand. I got one label.
They all look like that.
They said, no, I talked to Gabriel, and he said, we're doing a beer called Big Hugs. It's a giant kitty cat destroying a city. Draw something and we'll see what happens. And so I drew a giant kitty cat, and they printed it up and put it on a bottle. And then a month later they called me again and said, we're doing a thing called Ginger Twin. And it's two big burly dudes with beards, two longshoremen, and it's called Ginger Twin. Run with that. So I drew that one. And then they just kept asking me to keep doing it. So I had no idea that I was embarking on a project, you see. I just went with the information that I was given, and no one told me to be consistent or have any brand statements in mind when I was doing it. So then I got used to that. Then it became a permanent thing. And so now I'm always trying to do something a little bit strange, and I definitely think we fit in with what you were saying, where you like establish the space where anything could happen. Because if I can, send a giant kitty cat back to the Cretaceous period, or send a double-headed donkey into space, then no one's going to get put off when I think of something stranger than that, probably. And hopefully, I hope that, like, the 5th time somebody sees a bomber of ours in the shop and says, what the hell is that? And looks at it and sees, oh, it's a half acre, and they just start to associate bafflement with half acre labeling.
The word, like in the realm of trying to explode it out so that you can do anything, right? I mean, that is like the ultimate platform, because what you're looking for is freedom to say things so that you can be understood. I mean, there's like, we do the logo, I do the Lagunitas logo in like a body bold, I do it in a copper plate bold, I do it this font called Opti I-10, I do it in Helvetica, and I do it in this crazy script font, I can't remember, it's at the very bottom of the Apple pull menu, I mean, this is sort of, so every time I get a new version of iOS, I always get new fonts, and we end up doing a label in another font. But we just did a few trucks around Chicago, and we've done a bunch of them in California, where on the side I take it in copper plate, and it's like red with a little outline and an inline on it, and it says Lagunitas, starting from the cab, going back, and as it goes back, with Photoshop I took it out and sort of squidged it out, so it looks like it's bleeding off the back of the truck from the wind to the road and stuff. But it's in like 5,000 frickin' point type, it's a big deal. And when it came time to do the other side of the truck, I sent what do you think? And I was high. I sent it off to the guy from the truck company, and he says, well, what do you want me to do on the other side? I'm like, well, what do you mean? He goes, well, if I put it on, it'll be backwards, And I'm like, I thought, wow, I'm gonna have to redo it. But the problem is, it's not the ITAS that'll get blown off, it's the LAGU that'll get blown off, and it won't be as readable. And so I said, yeah, of course, flip it around, that's what I meant for you to do. And so the back side of the truck, this starts with the L, by the cab, and the back end goes up. It's entirely, from beginning to end, backwards. So, in playing with perception, but still, people knew exactly what it said. I've never had anyone tell me it was backwards. No one's even pointed it out. It's almost as if either they don't notice or they figure that they don't want to tell us, because we should know. So this one San Francisco television company, takes one of the road cams, and it's right along the Bay, East Shore Freeway by Berkeley, and the truck's coming northbound, and that means it's going out towards Sacramento, and the Bay's behind it, and it says Lagunitas, but it says it backwards in 5,000 point type, so you can see it on the little shot that they took. And when they came back and showed that same shot later, they flipped it around so that it said Lagunitas correctly, but the Bay was on the wrong side, and that seemed acceptable to them. So it's just funny the way you can play with people's perception with your own brand, I mean, what Brooklyn does with that B is like magic, I mean, and they would be wrong to ever vary from it, But it's better though in a way if you can get a platform that's a platform for freedom in design.
I just want to confirm that you're not using vectors, that you're actually setting 5,000 point type.
Well, I don't know, what's the size of what's the size of the semi-truck?
What visuals are you doing this at?
It might be 5, I don't know what, the semi-truck's 10 foot tall, I don't know what font is that anyway. I mean, I gave it to them, to scale, they blew it up, so. And I don't know, we just took the river cruise, the architectural river cruise, about some people from Petaluma were in, trying to dip them in Chicago, and the Trump Tower, that's 5,000 point type going up there in the center.
So while we're on the topic of, how much flexibility can you have with your brand, I want to talk a little bit about collaborations. So we hear a lot of talk about breweries collaborating on recipes, but what does that mean in terms of design? So, Phineas, you've done a number of labels that are collaborations. Some look a lot talk a little bit about like what that process is like and how much do you compromise? Sorry, my phone is ringing. How much do you compromise in terms of your brand?
Well, most of the collaborations, let me say, we've done a lot of them with Three Floyds, which are probably the ones we've done the most collaborating with. We've done like 3 years of She-Wolf and Annika and a couple of other things. And those were all just me. Like, I would sketch something up, Gabriel would look at it, send it off to Nick, and Nick would grunt in assent, probably. And he's not real robust. And, you know, then I would just do it, and since I know Half Acre, and I've done work with Nick, and we're pretty well aligned in, like, this can be as weird as we feel like it, then it turns out to be kind of a triangulation between our two things so that they're not that far apart to begin with. Yes was completely different just because Micheal has their own really specific thing going on. It is so nothing like anything I would ever do. I'm not, just his style is Keith Shore is Keith Shore, and it's completely opposite of mine. So I think we kind of like stayed out of each other's way. Like, we're not gonna be able to make the same image. So what we ended up doing was, it was called Guest, and we decided that there would be like an indoor and an outdoor. And so since we were at home, I would draw the things on the inside part of it, and Keith drew people coming in from the outside, and that was how that happened. And it actually worked out pretty well. I think people were pretty into the label, and we've done it a couple of times now, and certainly everyone likes the beer. And I never am clear how much it's the label and how much it's the beer. I want to take credit for things. I was like, you know, it could have been in a paper bag and you'd still like it. But I try not to get too down on myself. People ask me what I do for a living sometimes, and I will say, well, you know, the thing you throw away when you're done with a beer, I decorate that. So yeah, like trash decorator is my job on Sundays. We're just doing a collaboration. The first beer of which is coming out this week that we did with Tired Hands in Pennsylvania, and the brewer, designer, and Tired Hands did part of the drawings, and I did part of the drawings. And it was an interesting thing simply because he has no digital capacity. So he just sent me scans of his drawings, and I had to like work around it in Photoshop. And it would have been a lot easier, and I think a lot more fun if we had been in the same place, but that wasn't possible. But those are coming out soon, and they don't look like anything else that we've put out. If you're paying attention, the first one will be out later this week.
Well, we've got a mango juniper pale ale coming out that was a collaboration with Five Rabbit and Nør, the Norwegian, that's how they say it, Nør, the Norwegian brewery. And we haven't really figured out what we're going to do label-wise, so we're going to have to give it some space because they have just that O with the bar through it, and it needs a little room to breathe, so I don't know. But I do the labels for the brewery in Southern California, and for their collaborations, we create, you know, they have those die-cut labels, and we have a special die-cut for the collabs, and the art features two kind of interpenetrating shapes, one that kind of goes from the top to the bottom, and another one goes left to right, and they sort of intersect and cross through each other, and the one we give over totally to the brand image of whoever the collaborator is, and then the other one we keep pretty much in the vocabulary from the brewery. So it gives us a nice brewery look, but also gives a nice contained space for the collaborators. So that's one way of solving the problem anyway.
Tony, you've taken a pretty strong stance against collaborations, just in the sense of,
Well,
diluting the brand. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on?
yeah. You know, it's not a stance against. You know, we don't can, and everyone assumes, well, that means because they hate canning. You know, the world's not binary like that. You know, so and so if we don't make it saison, it's not because I think saisons suck. It's just because other people.
Perfect beer name, saison sucks.
Well, it's just you gotta you pick your battles carefully in life, and so you want to do the things you do as well as you can, and leave the rest of other things for others to do. And there's an old saying, your opposition will always get stronger than what you leave behind, but that assumes that the other breweries are our opposition. I think the way as craft beer evolves, there's so many different models that are. I mean, everyone, for the record, like Boston Beer, is really the Boston Cider Company. They sell way more Angry Orchard than they sell Sam Adams, and sooner or later they'll sell more tea. And it's like, that somehow we're all supposed to be seen as being in the same industry together. The truth is, I think there's a lot of strata, and the businesses become very, 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 very different operations. I mean, Solemn Oath. It's like, well, we have the liquid in common. We got what we need, water. We have tanks and stainless steel and yeast and trucks and diesel and all the rest of that in common. But Lagunitas has that in common with Anheuser-Busch. We're in completely different businesses. So I just think that the people need to kind of plow their own furrows and find their own way to kind of be themselves. It's as simple as that. And as far as collaborations go, a bunch of other breweries do that, and it's a cool thing. A good friend of mine who worked for one of the oldest breweries in the country. He was employee number 3. He's a cool guy. He's the ultimate cynic, and he doesn't like collaborations either. And now I remember we're all from San Francisco, and he said, "Gee, I didn't even know gay marriage was legal." So collaborations are definitely a sharing of bodily fluids, and sometimes and that can. Well, it just is that, right? And not only, I'm not talking about beer, but I'm talking about sharing your brand equities, And so the larger brewery that has a bigger exposure to larger audience benefits from the exposure to the younger, kind of smaller niche set that the smaller brewery does, and the smaller brewery gets this exposure to a big crowd. It can be great things. In fact, I mean, and this is only for me, I see it as like parasitic, I think the little breweries have so much cool stuff to offer, and they should, and just offer it and be that, and listen closely to your customers and move on down the line. Decide if you want to be 100,000 barrels, and it's, but it's not an either or. It's not a good or bad thing, It's just a kind of a direction I haven't gone over the years. But we do this fusion series, and we did this all along, where we go into neighborhoods and find bar owners, because those are the people that are initially buying the beer from us, or we bring distributors in, because they're the ones who initially buying. We want to enlist their support and have them, find a common cause with us, and then hopefully they'll introduce us to their customers who will be beer lovers, So.
I used to think that collaboration beers were kind of just like a smart marketing move for some people, right? That it was a good sort of brand collaboration kind of a play. And I think in a lot of ways it probably tends to be for the most part. And if we were lucky, we would actually get a pretty interesting beer out of it if they put that in. But talking to Gabriel from Acre last week, I sat down for an interview with him, and I asked him about collaboration beers. And he kind of reframed it for me a little bit. He talked about how, breweries are a workaday operation. You are heads down inside of a building at least from 9 to 5, if not 9 to 9. And you don't really get a lot of chance to poke your head up and look around and see what's going on outside of you. And so if you get a chance when you meet another brewer and they're interested in doing something with you in a collaboration beer, which is really, you don't have a lot of mechanisms for working together, he sees it as a great chance to bring some of their thinking into that brewery for the day in a way that surprises him, that shows him different ways of thinking, and it opens up the walls of that brewery in a different dimension for him. And he gets to have a lot of fun for a day with another brewer who thinks differently, who sees their beer differently. There's a lot of knowledge sharing that goes on, a lot of even equipment. I know when Shuttle from Nugno was in town, you guys his reason for contacting you was to get a hold of one of those two-piece spinning IBU meter things that you had sort of made back in the day, and that led to you guys actually making a beer together. And so, I don't know, I certainly think that there's plenty of collaborations out there that are maybe sort of being smart about who's got a bigger audience and who doesn't, and who can benefit from this and that. But Gabriel did a great job of reframing that for me in a way that made me realize that, like, yeah, you guys don't get to actually do much other than brew beer and go to festivals, and that's when you get to talk to other brewers. Bringing them into your house for a day, and getting to spend that time together becomes almost like a sacred sort of a day for you, regardless of what happens after that. You get to invite them into your home and do something special together, and then you actually get this, you get to drink a beer that you made together after. It's a pretty special thing.
Katie, do you have any thoughts? I mean, I'm sure collaboration is a huge part of achieving the final result of what you guys are doing too.
Yeah, I feel like with brewing, I think that you can do collaborations, you can not do collaborations, but with design, actually, I think it's all a collaboration and the whole process is a collaboration. We typically start out, either working with the graphic designer or getting kind of the direction from the graphic designer with what the brand is going to be. So there's that initial collaboration right there. There's a collaboration between us and the brewer or the owner from day one in terms of what we're creating, and then it goes on to sort of a micro level where we start looking at who do we want to work with, who else speaks to this brand, and who else is going to help us build